what are the prospects of having our campaign be to have more pressure on the politicians who are running this coming federal election?
Well, I think that in terms of the, can you hear me?
Yeah.
In terms of the TPP, it's going to be over before the election, I think. I don't think we're going to have an early election. The election's probably going to be next year. So the vote on the TPP implementing legislation is likely to come up in October. But in terms of the longer term trade policy, I think that the Liberal National Government has shot itself in the foot, especially in the last week. And so we are more likely to get a change of government. And the Labor Party does actually have a better trade policy. And they have said that when they are in government, they will not, for instance, make new trade agreements which include ISDS or medicine monopolies or a lot of the things that are in the TPP 11. But the problem is that the TPP will already be in place. They have said they will try to change some of those provisions, so we'll have to hold them to that. So I think in the context of the election campaign, what we'll have to do is campaign for our vision of a more just trade policy and to try and hold them to the positive parts of their trade policy. The Greens have actually got quite a good policy on trade, and as I said, the Centre Alliance, which used to be the Nick Xenophon team, are also better on a lot of these issues. So, there is a possibility for having more space to argue if there's a change of government. I think in terms of the TPP itself, as I said, it's going to be very hard to get Labor to actually knock it back, to vote against the implementing legislation, but I think it's very important that we put as much pressure on them as possible. Amongst the left in the Labor Party, there is an appetite for having that debate, and this whole process is educating politicians about what's wrong with trade agreements. I also think that even the global debate about trade agreements is at least raising the issue of why trade agreements haven't delivered what they've promised. So, but the problem is that we have this America First, very right-wing reaction, which is really not going in a progressive direction at all. So it's very important that we put out our vision, which is not about nationalism or racism or any of those things, but it is about saying we need to have an inclusive trade policy that includes all countries.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Margie Yen. Would you like to comment on how the single country trade agreements like the Australia-Indonesia one sort of relates to or interacts with the TPP?
Yes, well, Indonesia's not a member of the TPP, so that will be a separate preferential agreement. But the problem with preferential agreements is that they are preferential. In other words, what they do is say that we will just reduce tariffs for your country. And in the case of the TPP, it's a regional agreement, so we'll just reduce tariffs under certain conditions for those other those 11 countries. Now, there is an organisation, as we know, called the World Trade Organisation, which has 194 members, and that's what's called the Multilateral Trade Organisation, and that is supposed to negotiate agreements which has the same reductions of trade barriers and the same conditions for all of those countries. The trouble is that when you get into preferential trade agreements, each agreement has to work out how you can prove that your products actually come from your country, which is called rules of origin, and then how the specific preferential tariffs apply. And that leads you to what's called a noodle bowl of different rules. So, and even industry complains about this. The Australian Industry Group says, for example, if you take a country like Malaysia at the moment, we have a free trade agreement with Malaysia, which is one set of bilateral preferential rules. We also have a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, which is the second set of rules, and the TPP will be a third set of rules. So if you make widgets in Australia, you have to know about all of those three agreements, and you have to work out which one is most favourable for you. And of course, most small, particularly small producers, it's too much trouble. They don't bother, or they're not aware of which agreements they can use. So there is an underutilisation of these agreements. But our government in particular has really gone in for a sort of notch in the belt, the more trade agreements the better. And so these are all contributing to this noodle bowl of different rules, even at that sort of very practical level. They don't want to. One of the things they've been asked to do is to cancel the previous agreements when they get the new ones. But they don't want to do that because for some industries, some aspects of the previous agreements are actually more favourable than what they got in the TPP. So yes, it's just mind-boggling.
All right. Thanks, Pat. Rob Long. The public service stuff that you talk about is obviously a real concern, and I'm a tape teacher, so we're living what you described in relation to the private companies coming in and just bastardising, completely race to the bottom. We hadn't thought about that, an international company could then sue the government for changes to regulation. Could what we're going through also happen to public hospitals? Could it happen to public schools and you mentioned public transport? Could you expand on that? And the last bit of my question is Bitcoin. I have really no understanding of it, but is there something in the TPP where they actually also want to control our currency? Or is Bitcoin trying to take over that governments have the right to control their own currency? You don't have to answer the Bitcoin bit.
Yes, well, the thing about services is that they're included unless they're specifically excluded. The private tape situation is sort of ambiguous because what you have there is you have public provision alongside private provision, and the private provision is already there. Because the TPP wasn't in place when the current federal government re-regulated, or I know it wasn't adequate, but they did some re-regulation. That wasn't effective. But let's say if the Labor government comes in the future and the TPP is in place and the Labor government says, well, actually, we don't think private tape provision is a good idea, let's go back to public. At that point, you could face either a complaint from another government, or if there was a private provider from a TPP country, they could then say, well, you're affecting the value of our investment. The same could happen with private hospitals. If there was a private hospital, a hospital that had been privatised under a previous government, say in New South Wales, change of government, new government says, take it back into the public, which has happened in New South Wales with Macquarie Hospital and so on. Macquarie Harbour, Port Macquarie Hospital. Then you could have that situation too if the private provider was from a TPP country. What was the next bit? Sorry? Oh, the Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin isn't part of trade agreements at all. Bitcoin is a private venture, and it is actually an attempt to privatise currency, which is usually controlled by national governments. My advice about Bitcoin is just stay away from it because it isn't regulated. There are no guarantees. Governments are now thinking about how they might regulate it, but in my opinion, it's an example of global markets just going mad. It's making a lot of money for a few people, but any money that people make out of it is extremely transitory. It just goes up and down like a yo-yo. Yeah. She's making the, yeah. The comment was that if you sell it, the money has to go through banks. Are you saying that? I thought it didn't have to go through banks, and so it's not taxed. Oh, right.
Not in market, but if you are just a regular person and you have on your money goes into the bank, it's taxed as income in the capital gains.
Yes, well, I actually think everyone should pay income tax. But I think part of Bitcoin's attraction to investors is it's a kind of in that grey area, and it's more difficult to tax probably.
I've got another question here.
Thank you for your presentation, Pat. My interest at the moment is China. How China in relation
China,
to GDP.
Yes, that's something I should have mentioned. Because the TPP was very much initiated by the US, it was certainly part of the US competition with China in this region. In fact, that quote from Obama did say the TPP is about the US writing the rules rather than China writing the rules. As we know, this rivalry between China and the US, China as a rising power, and especially in our region, but also globally, is creating tension and competition, and it's strategic and military as well as economic competition. So China's not part of the TPP. There is another trade agreement which is being negotiated called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, more alphabet soup, which consists of China, Japan, India, South Korea, the 16 ASEAN countries, the 10 ASEAN countries plus Australia and New Zealand, so it's 16 countries altogether. So that's actually a bigger agreement than the TPP, and China and India and Japan and Korea are all involved. So it's seen by some as a kind of alternative to the TPP. But in fact, because Japan and in particular and Australia are involved, they've been trying to make to take a lot of provisions from the TPP and put them into the RCEP. And there's a fight going on about that because the ASEAN countries and India don't really want to have a lot of those provisions about medicine monopolies and ISDS and so on. But if we look at generally at the rivalry between China and the US, it's very clear that Trump's America First sort of policy is really about rejecting most of the current trade rules, including the World Trade Organization, and trying to force all the US's trading partners to have new trade agreements which are more favourable to the US. So it's a kind of rejection of a rules-based system, and really the rule of the strongest. And the two strongest economies that are going up against each other are China and the US. So the US has implemented tariff increases against Chinese goods. There's actually been 2 rounds of that. The Chinese are retaliating, and the US is about to implement another round. So that's very dangerous, actually, for the global economy, because it will not only affect those 2 economies, but other economies as well, like Australia, for example. If the Chinese economy starts slowing because of that trade war with the US, then the goods that Australia sells to China will also be reduced. I'm not sure whether that answers what you had in mind, but
Any more questions or comments people want to make? Please.
Thanks. My name's Sam Hanson. My question was, hypothetically in the future, let's say a country just wants out of one of these free trade agreements they realise it's not in their interest. What would be the process that a country has to go through to be like, no, we're getting rid of these ISDS mechanisms, things like that?
thanks. Most trade agreements do have a provision for withdrawal, and basically it's relatively easy if it's a bilateral agreement just between 2 countries. They usually say either country can give notice, and then after a certain period, and there may be some other conditions, but the agreement can be terminated. That's what the US threatened to do with Canada and Mexico with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is only 3. But when you get to something the size of the TPP-11, it becomes more complicated, because you actually have to negotiate the withdrawal with all of those other countries, and depending on what's in the agreement, you may have to compensate them for the loss of trade. The same with the WTO, which is a global agreement. If you actually withdraw from WTO agreements, then you need to compensate other countries. So that makes it practically impossible, unless the other countries agree. And now, with something like ISDS, it might be possible to find countries in the TPP which don't want to have ISDS. The New Zealand government, for example, has actually done what they call side letters with 5 of the TPP countries, saying that they agree not to apply ISDS to each other. So, you can make those sort of side letter type agreements. And in fact, that's one of the ways that if the Labor government came into office, we would be pushing them to implement their policy and withdraw from ISDS, because they say they're not in favour of it, or their policy is against it. So, but basically, trade agreements are designed to lock in future governments. So they're hard to withdraw from. If they're smaller, it's easier, but if they're bigger, it's harder.
All right, is there any other comments, questions? Yeah?
Simon Bowring. I mentioned this to Pat during the break. Perhaps you could just comment on the fact that the irony of these right-wingers bringing in bureaucracy en masse. It's always struck me as incredibly ironic that these free trade agreements are not really free trade. They've got so many rules, rules of origin, etc. Yes. So it's really just a comment.
Yeah. Yes, well, I think free trade, the term free trade is a very ideologically loaded term, because when people hear it, they think, oh, that must be good, It's free trade, it's removing barriers, it might mean cheaper, TVs or mobile phones or whatever, because there'll be less tariffs. And some of that happens, but the problem is that, as Simon has just indicated, actually especially something like the TPP, which has 30 chapters and 6,000 pages, it's actually a complex web of new regulation, and that new regulation favours global corporations and actually restrains governments from doing things that governments should be doing, like making medicines cheaper or and of course the ultimate irony is the use of free trade agreements to actually extend monopolies in areas like medicines and copyright, where, you know, what's free trade about, what is free or competition? Monopolies are the opposite of free trade and competition, which is supposed to be what free trade agreements are about. So yes, I do think there is a lot of loading, ideological loading in that term, and it doesn't really describe what's going on.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to ask some more questions? I've got, yes.
John, my question just comes from what you were talking about with Trump. I mean, all the free trade agreements since, say, Bretton Woods, so the last 60 or 70 years, have depended on people saying, okay, we'll knock out a trade agreement and there'll be winners and losers, and then we'll go on from there. I mean, I was coming home this afternoon and Trump said he would lead the World Trade Organization. Now, that might be bluster, he might have a different tweet at 10 o'clock tonight and another one at 4 o'clock in the morning. But when he wakes up, if he did that and the system collapsed, he's obviously hoping that in that sort of situation the world will come running to America because they're a big economy and he can negotiate anything in his favour. Is that a possibility?
Well, if you look at the World Trade Organization, we are also critical of its current rules, but our AFTINET believes that we do need global trade rules, but they should be fairer. So we do believe that you do need an agreed system between all of the countries of the world that actually has fair rules for trade. Now, at the moment, WTO rules are very unbalanced. They're very biased against developing countries, for example, and they're dominated by the big players like the US, the EU, Japan, and increasingly the rising ones like China. So, if the US withdraws from the WTO, that would cause a lot of chaos in the global trading system, because at the moment that would mean that the US could implement trade sanctions, in other words, higher tariffs. They could just pick and choose who they favoured and who they didn't in trade negotiations. So the idea of having a global system is that you actually have a set of rules which balances to some extent the leverage power of the strongest economies and gives a bit more say to some of the weaker economies. But I agree with you that I think Trump often threatens to use as leverage. So I think that in reality the US would probably lose more in the long run than it gains from withdrawing from all trade rules, but he is prepared to make that threat, and his general attitude is, we don't really believe, sorry, my voice is gone. He's prepared to make that threat, and he wants to have a system where not, can't go on, we're not.
Take some more water.
Where might is right, and the strongest rule. That's not in our interests. It's not in the interests of those countries.
Okay, we might wind it up there. Thank you very much.